Senator Carr.
I move to take note of the report. The government's response to the Senate report on the future of the automotive industry has finally been tabled and incorporated 2 years after the Senate actually delivered its report, and it only has done so in response for an order for the production of documents as proposed by Senator Xenophon. Now, this is an extraordinary thing in itself, and this pathetic, miserable response is a reflection of the government's attitude to the automotive industry. This is an industry that we recall has been driven in terms of its manufacturing component. The original producers have been driven out of this country by the actions of this government. One can never forget, and this country should never forget, the statements that were made in 2015 by the Minister, the Acting Prime Minister, Mr Truss, and by Mr Hockey, who treated with open contempt in fact, it wasn't 2015, it was prior to that date, the statements that were made in attacking General Motors Holden, which led to General Motors Holden withdrawing their manufacturing facilities from this country, and subsequently Toyota as well. You recall Mr Abbott, who said as Leader of the Opposition, when he was Leader of the Opposition, proposed to remove $500 million from the Automotive Transformation Scheme. And of course this is a part of the Liberal Party now in government which had celebrated the attacks upon the automotive industry, an industry that at the time employed 48,000 people directly, some 200,000 people indirectly. And of course this was an attack upon an industry which at that time was under discussions with the government, the Labor government, to propose 2 new models, both for Holden and for Toyota, 2 new models to be built in Australia at a time when the dollar was at a post-parity level, which in these current circumstances would now have seen that industry, of course, in a much, much stronger position given where the dollar is today. It would have been seen an industry able to actually survive and strengthen, as we did during the economic crisis, the world economic crisis, which saw this industry attract additional investment in this country when the rest of the industry around the world was actually in retreat. Now, what we now know is that the consequences of this government's action has been to see extraordinary economic devastation across many of the suburbs of the southeast of this country. A negative annual shock of some $29 billion is forecast. That's 2% of GDP. It's been predicted will be the consequences of the actions of this government. And already we're seeing, in terms of not just in economic terms, but in social terms, the extraordinary effect that the destruction of manufacturing and automotive, the vehicle industry, is having. We know in Craigieburn, the north of Melbourne, the applications for social security payments at record levels. We know that in Craigieburn, payments on social security increased by $30 million. Over 2,000 extra people on social security. We're seeing this pattern developing in other parts of the western suburbs of Melbourne, in Werribee and Derrimut. And what has this, and we see it of course in the southeast as well, and this is a pattern that's reflected around where the big automotive plants have been. We're seeing when the supply chain companies that service these industries. And we know what the consequences were in Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi, I recall, closed, and my first job as minister was to actually deal with that. That was a consequence of the previous government. My first job as Industry Minister was to reveal that Mitsubishi was closing its doors under the previous Liberal government. And we know the consequence of that was that two-thirds of workers at Mitsubishi were not able to secure work at the same level. 1/3, of course, the workers never worked again. 1/3, of course, received work, are unemployed. A third were very much part-time, and 1/3, of course, were able to secure some work, but only a third. Now, this is in an industry, we're seeing the same pattern, despite the efforts of the major vehicle producers to provide support for workers in their plants. We know that workers are at this time receiving job offers considerably below their current employment in the automotive industry. Now, you do not earn a king's fortune in the auto industry. The average wage for an auto worker was $60,000 a year. $60,000. In the parts component, it's $55,000. In the original equipment manufacturing plants, it's $70,000. The average is $60 grand a year. So these are not people that are excessively paid, but there's quality work. It's skilled work. These are people that are below the average skill levels for the rest of manufacturing. Many of them have certificate level qualifications or advanced diplomas. Many of them have university degrees. These are skilled people who cannot find work at the equivalent in their current situation. And what have we got from this government? This report is a mishmash of underfunded, oversubscribed programs. The current measures that the government's just recently announced, 81 new applications, 49 for the $49 million that's available. No guarantee whatsoever that any of that money will go to auto workers. All of those suburbs that employ auto workers, where they live, none whatsoever. The southeast of Melbourne and the west of Melbourne or in Adelaide. What we know, of course, is that there is no guarantee of support for the supply chains. And the manufacturing growth centres that this government speaks highly of, what we know is the big beneficiaries of that. Well, we know the CEOs. The advanced manufacturing CEO of the growth centre is getting $485,000. The cybersecurity CEO is getting $433,000. The food and agricultural business CEO is getting $401,000. We know the big beneficiaries there. Well, what else can we say about the great hallmark of this government's manufacturing policies, its growth centre strategy? What is it that they've got to say is the measure of success for this strategy? What is it? What we know in turn is a government that turns its back on R&D, and the measures that have been proposed in this report go to the issue of R&D. Now, tragically, the automotive industry used to be the single largest element of our manufacturing R&D in this country. What's this government got to say? Oh, it blandly says, well, of course, there will continued presence of the R&D centres in Australia will, of course, be assumed. No, it cannot. No, it cannot. It verbal's General Motors about what decisions it's making about its plant in Port Melbourne at the moment. It verbal's it. This report openly verbal's it. It says the decision's been made. It has not. There is no suggestion anywhere that the automotive companies will continue their support once the ATS program, the Automotive Transformation Program money runs out. So what's this government got to say on other areas? Well, it says it's discovered that parallel imports are something we should try and stop. It's been drag kicking and screaming to that proposition. A proposition that this report, of course, advanced, and I've been arguing for some time, 2 years ago. But this government, of course, knows that at the first opportunity they'll be back. Like a dog returning to its vomit, the neoliberals of this government will be back to try and get grey imports into this country under the guise of suddenly we will produce cheaper cars, just like they do in New Zealand. Junk out of Japan. And of course so that we can ensure that we have older cars in this country and reduce our capacity. Well, of course, then the government says, well, we're doing great things on environmental standards. Well, what have we got to say on that? Under the government scheme, the zealots in the Environment Department have been let loose, so we've got a carbon tax on motor cars now, which the government says, oh, no, we won't. We just put out a report. We had a bit of a discussion. A madcap scheme they introduce, which won't even allow the Prius to get through unscathed. Toyota's Prius won't get through unscathed. But what's this government say? Well, that's fine. That's fine, because we just it's out there for discussion. This report is a mishmash of nonsense, because the government has no clear understanding of where it wants to go on automotive. Now, in Thatcher's Britain, it was understood what a disaster Margaret Thatcher had been to the automotive industry in England. They came to realise in England that it didn't have to be that way. And now parties on both sides of the fence have understood the importance of automotive, and they've rebuilt the automotive industry in England. So it's the largest the largest exporter of automotive parts and vehicles in Europe. And it's a pity this government hadn't learnt that message instead of listening to the zealots and the madcap schemes from those that think it's better to destroy an industry like they've done rather than build the capabilities of Australians, build our capacity to actually build wealth for Australian people rather than destroy an industry in the way in which this government has so deliberately sought to do.
Thank you, Senator Carr.